Hello and welcome to the Basics of Stereo Tracking in Roto Part 2. This is the roto side of the stereo workflow, and if you haven't seen how to set up a stereo project or how to track it, please see Part 1, which is available on the website. So here we have our stereo footage. We've got our left and our right eyes, and we can view that in our stereo mode. And we can see here he's moving the plate towards the camera to get a nice big depth effect. So what we want to do here is actually colour this piece of fish to be slightly more saturated to make it really pop. So what we're going to do is do a mask around the fish, track that in stereo, and then export the result out to Nuke. So like last time, we're going to track at the end frame because that's where the most detail is in the shot. When you're tracking in Mocha, it's always best to track from the largest point where the object is shown and where the most texture detail is. And in this case, that's right at the end. So I'm going to turn off my 3D view so I just see the left eye in the viewer, and I'm going to select the X-Spline tool. If you prefer, you could also use the Bezier spline if you're used to the pen tool in, say, Nuke or After Effects or Photoshop, but we recommend using the X-Spline tool because we find it generally does roto a lot quicker, and it also distorts really nicely with our planar data. So I'm going to hold down the Z key now and just zoom in a little bit so we can see this fish up close, and we'll start drawing our shape. So I'm going to draw it all the way around this fish here, and we'll just make it nice and tight around the edge here. Now keep in mind this is only one way to track a shape. You could actually draw a larger shape to capture more of the outside edge and then link a refined roto shape to your track, but in this instance we've got a nice simple textured area to work with, so I'm just going to track the single shape and then refine it after I've done my track. So now that we have it rotoed, we just need to set up our parameters. So down here in our motion parameters in the track tab, we've already set translation, scale, rotation and shear by default, but in this particular instance, if we scrub through the shot, we can see how that fish turns and rotates in perspective. So I'm going to add the perspective motion parameter to my track. Now in the previous example, in part 1, we didn't care about perspective, shear and rotation because we were dealing with a label that we actually wanted to float directly in space. In this particular instance, we want our roto to actually follow along with the fish, so that perspective, shear and rotation is actually now important. We also want to set a minimum percentage of pixels quite high, and in this instance the default value has actually done pretty well, and 90% is a good value to start with, so I'm going to keep that there. If you do a similar track and your percentage is a little bit lower than this, we recommend ramping it up to about 90 to get a good level of accuracy. Remember, with minimum percentage of pixels, the larger the value in here, the more accurate it is, but the slower the track is going to be. And that can be entirely dependent on the resolution of your footage as well. So that's our parameters set up, so now all we need to do is start tracking. And like before in part 1, we need to make sure we set the Operate on All Views button so that Mocha tracks the left view and the right view as well. So because we're dealing with perspective tracking, I'm also going to turn on my surface and grid just so we can see how that tracking is going. So I'm going to move this surface tool around and align that grid with the fish. And even though we don't care about using our tracking data in this instance, it's just good to keep this lined up with what you're tracking so that you can actually see how that track is going. The roto information can obviously be tweaked, but it's better to try and get as good and useful tracking data as possible so you can use it later if necessary. Okay, so we're set up now and we can start tracking backwards. And as we track this, we're seeing it track really nicely to that fish. And if we switch over to the right view, you can see that's locking on as well. So this is a really quick and powerful workflow because you're not having to do your tracking and roto twice, it's working it all out on the fly and then offsetting that data correctly between the eyes. So if we scroll back through that timeline, we can see that locking on, and if we switch between those views, we can see that grid really looking nice between left and right. So I'm going to turn off the surface and grid now because we only actually care about the roto in this instance. So if we scrub through our timeline here, we can just see how well that roto is working. And it's actually not done too bad a job, but we're probably going to have to do a little bit of tweaking because this fish isn't a completely planar object, so we're going to have to go ahead and tweak some of these control points to make it fit across all the frames. So this is where stereo roto in Mocha Pro 4 becomes really interesting. We've done our tracking work, so our roto is locking on to the left and right eyes quite well, but now we need to tweak those control points in both views. To do this, what we've done is assigned a hero view to our layer. By default, it's the hero view you set in your project settings, and we can see that up here in project settings. default hero view is left. And you can choose which default hero view you want up here. By default, we always use left, but some people may want to choose right. So we've defined this left hero view for our project. So now, whenever we tweak a control point and go over to the right, that control point is also modified in this view. So these right control points are being modified by our hero view, but they're being offset correctly by the tracking data. So I'll just go back to my left view and we'll undo that operation. And let's do a more realistic thing. So I'm going to zoom down here and just tweak these values to make sure that our control points are resting nice and tightly around the fish. And when we switch over to the right, we can see that being offset correctly for that view. So what we want to do now is go through the whole timeline in the left view, and we'll switch back to the left, and make sure that our points are looking correct. So we can see this point needs to come down a little bit tight around here, and we'll just tweak those points around the edge here to make sure it's sitting nicely around the edge of that fish. And we'll just scrub through our timeline here and make sure it's looking okay. We can see a little bit of a tweak there, so I'm going to move that in like so. And we'll smooth that a little bit just to make sure it's really tight around the edge. Now, just to save time, I'm going to speed up the video and do some final little tweaks for this view, and then we'll come back and look at the right. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that basic shape for my left view, but now we need to see the right view to make sure it's all translated across really nicely. So I'm going to switch over to the right, and let's just scrub through that timeline and see how we've gone. So this is actually locked on pretty well. We can see a little bit of a pop happening about here, so I'm going to go back to the left view, pressing my 1 key, and just pull that point in a little bit, and then that's locking on really, really nicely. And we'll keep on coming through here. We see a little bit of a pop here too, so I'm going to come back here, tweak that just a little bit, and then look in that right. So we can keep on going through and viewing that left and right back and forth, but it's always best to go back to that left view first to make sure that it's all tweaking correctly. So this is really great when we've got a right view or a non-hero view where they're perfectly offset and there's only tweaks you need to do in the left view. But what happens when there is a difference between the views and we need to actually tweak only that right view? For this example, I'm going to go back to that frame 26 that we tweaked before, and we can see just a slight pixel outline here on the left, so I'm going to tweak that in a little bit, and again, we'll look at that right. But in the right, we can see it's just outside the area where we want it. So what we need to do is modify it in the right view. So I'll just tweak those values a little bit. I'm going to move this control point in and this one here just a little bit to make sure it's sitting nicely on that edge. And what's happened is it's created a right view keyframe in the timeline. So I'm just going to move this playhead out of the way so it's easier to see. What you can see here is we've got a left view keyframe that's hollowed out and a right view keyframe that's filled in. The reason this is filled in is because we're currently sitting in the right view. And if I switch back to the left, pressing the 1 key, you'll see all those left view keyframes that we tweaked before also fill in. And now that right view keyframe is hollow. This is just a quick indication to tell you there's a right and a left view keyframe on this frame, but it also tells you what view you're currently working with. Now, it's important to note that once you've actually modified a keyframe in the non-hero view, in this case our right view, you can no longer offset it like you did before with the hero view. So sitting back here on frame 26 where we've got a left and a right view keyframe, if I modify in the left view now and switch back over to the right, you're not going to see that offset change from the left because we've already told Mocha that we have a defined right keyframe where we want it in this view. Finally, if you want to modify across both views at the same time, you can use this Apply Keyframe Changes to All Views button. If I switch to somewhere else in the timeline and now move this control point, you'll see it generates 2 keyframes for left and right, and it's actually changed it in both views. And if I modify it in the left, it will happen in the right, and if I modify it in the right, it will change directly in the left. Once you're actually done using the Apply Keyframe Changes to All Views button, it's a good idea to remember to immediately turn it off, because sometimes you may not want this on when you're doing other tweaks. So I'm just going to undo those changes now, zoom out, and just scrub through that timeline and make sure our left view is looking alright, and also our right view. And that's looking pretty good. So now that we're happy with our tracked roto, we just need to export it out. So coming down here to the Export Shape Data button, we click on that, and this brings up the Export Shape Data dialog. So under the drop-down, we've got a number of formats that we can come out to, such as Adobe Premiere and Flame. Here, I'm going to choose Nuke 6.2 Roto with Transform and Shape. And the difference between Nuke 6.2 Roto with Transform and Shape and Nuke Roto Basic is that the basic formats of the Nuke Roto nodes put a keyframe on every single frame, whereas these apply the transform separately and just apply the manual keys to your splines in Nuke. So this is a much lighter format to work with, which is why I'm choosing this one. So I'm going to select Export All Views because I want to bring out both my views, not just a left or a right. So we'll select that and select Copy to Clipboard. And now we can go over to Nuke and finish up the job. Okay, so like previously in part 1, we've already set up our stereo view here for Nuke, so we've got our left and right, and I've already joined them together with a Join Views node. For pasting in roto data, it's exactly the same as pasting in tracking data. So I've selected my Join Views node, and I'm just going to press Ctrl or Command V, and that pastes our roto data right into the view. So I'm just going to double click on that roto node, and we can see over here in the roto view that we've got a layer left and a layer right, and they've been mapped to either view. So if we switch between left and right, you can see that spline moving between left and right correctly in our viewer. So I'm just going to cut this view out now, so I'm going to change my output to alpha and pre-multiply as RGBA, and that just cuts out the fish layer, and if we look in left and right we can see that. So what we want to do now is merge this back on top of our original view. So I'm going to pull this over to the side here and create a merge node, and I'm going to merge my A, which is my rotoed piece of fish here, back over the top of my original view. So now we are seeing this rotated out fish sitting on top of our original plates. So I'm going to close up that roto so I don't see the splines in the viewer anymore. And the last thing we're going to do here is just apply a color correction node. So we'll come up here to the color nodes here and we'll come down to color correct. We could have also pressed C. So here, once we've set up this node here, we can now go ahead and tweak to color this fish in both views. So I'm just going to make that fill the screen a little bit better so we can see it. And let's go a little bit overboard and saturate this really a huge amount to make it really, really pop. And that's a bit garish, but you get the idea. We've got a nice rotoed out view sitting on top of that fish and nowhere else for that color correct. And if I switch to the right, you'll see that it bounces between those views correctly and doesn't color anywhere else outside those edges. So if I double click on my roto layer, we can see that roto in the view here, and I can just select my left or my right, depending on which view I need to work with. Finally, if we want to view that in stereo, we just need to create an anaglyph node. So I'm going to select my merge node here, and let's create an anaglyph. I've already got it selected here in the tab mode, so we'll put that in. We'll ramp that color back up to full, and we'll just close that roto and the color correct on the merge so we don't see anything in the view. And let's look at that in full screen. Okay, so let's press play and see the final result. So we can see how easy it is to track in both views inside Mocha, then modify between the left and right eyes, and then finally export it out to a program such as Nuke to do the final composite. Now obviously to finish this shot off properly, what you'd want to do is go back into Mocha and track and roto all the separate elements on the plate, and you also probably wouldn't want to colour it this horrific colour that I have in Nuke. So now that we've done the Nuke version, let's take a look at how we export that same data out to After Effects. So to do this, first of all we need to export again. So I'm going to come down to the Export Shape Data button, and instead of Nuke this time, we're going to come down to Export Shape Data for AE. Now when we select this option, you can see that Export All Views is once again switched off. This is because there's not an easy way to copy both views and then paste them to two separate views inside After Effects. So we need to export the left, and then we need to export the right. So I'm going to first copy my left view to the clipboard, And now we can move over to After Effects. Okay, so here we are inside After Effects, and I've already got my simple stereo setup done. So we've got our left and our right comps, and they're pointing to a 3D glasses effect on a stereo control layer, which is just a solid I've applied the effect to. So like last time, we're going to select our individual comps and paste the data that we need to each one. So first of all, let's select the left, and I'm going to choose the left movie I've got in this comp and duplicate it. And then we can come up to the edit menu and choose one of two options. We can either paste the data, and this will create the mocha shape effect in the effect controls, or we can paste mocha mask, which is converted to the After Effects splines rather than the mocha shape effect. So it's your choice which one you prefer, and in this instance I'm going to choose paste. And this creates our shape effect up in the effect controls for that layer. Back in Mocha, we just export the shape data again to get that right view, so I'm going to click Export Shape Data, come to my right view this time rather than the left, and again, copy to the clipboard. And then we can go back over to After Effects and apply that to the right comp. Okay, so we're back over in After Effects, and I'm going to choose my right comp, and we'll do the same process. I'm going to duplicate my right movie, come up to Edit, and do Paste. And then once again, that pastes that shape data into the right view. And if we solo the layer, we can see that cutting into place. So now we can go ahead and apply a color correction to both views. So for that, I'm just going to come up to Effect, and we'll come down to Color Correction, and this time we'll use a simple color balance, and let's do that bad saturation I did before in Nuke. So we'll really ramp it up and make it horrific, just so we can see that pop out and see that masking in action. So now I've done that in the right view, I'm just going to copy the color balance, and go back over to my left, and paste into that view as well. So now that's copied across, and the mask is cutting out correctly in both the left and in the right. So now if we go back over to our 3D view in the original comp, we can see that broadcasting correctly for left and right views in the 3D glasses effect. So even though in After Effects we have to go back to Mocha to grab separate views, it's still a quick process using the clipboard for both roto and tracking. We've designed the process specifically to work almost the same as if you were doing Mocha tracking and roto with only one view, but have given you strong control over how you handle your own stereo workflow. This new stereo toolset is across all the Mocha Pro 4 modules, and we'll be covering those in depth in other tutorials. So that wraps up this tutorial on the basics of stereo tracking and roto inside Mocha Pro 4. If you have any questions, please ask them on the forum at imagineersystems.com.